You'll sometimes hear them referred to as the Scottish Reivers, but they actually existed on both the English side and the Scottish side. And we're going to talk about how these people were a major component of the beginnings of America's Scotch-Irish migration. All right, so traditionally, the Gael and Pictish kingdoms in northern Britain were united under a single kingdom of Scotland under Kenneth MacAlpin in the year 843. And in 927, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of southern Britain became united as the Kingdom of England under King Athelstan. If you'll notice, I'm missing Wales in there. That union came later when England conquered Wales. Now, since that time through the year 1603, the two kingdoms fought several wars against each other with dozens of battles and countless more skirmishes. I mean, it was a huge rivalry. And obviously, one region where the wars took place very frequently was along the border between the two countries. And that's traditionally known as the borderlands. Now, in 1249, Henry III of England and Alexander III of Scotland signed a treaty and created kind of a buffer zone on both sides of the border that were known as marches. The marches on each side were divided into a western, middle, and eastern march. Now, it was very common in Europe for counties of a country that lay along a border with another country to be called marches. This is because they were more important to a country's defense. I mean, obviously you wanted those to be shored up more than counties that were on the interior. So on continents, the nobles put in charge of them were not mere counts. I mean, we get the word count from county as being the person that ruled it, but the next highest title up the nobility. So a march was ruled by a marquis or a margrave, depending upon the language. However, unlike the continent, the marches here were not administered by a hereditary noble. Instead, each of the 6 marches was administered by a warden appointed by the king, who was also charged with keeping the peace to prevent war. Now, to maintain the peace in times of truce, cross-border disputes were settled by the wardens at regular meetings that periodically took place on the border on pre-designated truce days. Aggrieved parties would then argue their case before the wardens to decide the dispute. So you would have a meeting between the 2 western wardens, the 2 middle wardens, and the 2 eastern wardens. The body of law created by this warden system existed in parallel, though not entirely separate from, the common law that governed England and the Scottish system of laws, making it one of the earliest examples of customary international law. March law, however, more closely resembled the Scottish legal system than English common law. Now, over time, as it developed, neither the English king or the Scottish king really liked having the marches after a while, but they were never really able to abolish them. There were several corridors along the border as well, where the border was undefined, creating particularly lawless areas known as the debatable lands. Neither kingdom wanted to try or was ever able to maintain order in the debatable lands, to the extent that the English and Scottish parliaments made a rather remarkable decree in the mid-1500s declaring that in the debatable lands, all Englishmen and Scotsmen are and shall be free to rob, burn, spoil, slay, murder, and destroy all and every such person and persons, their bodies, property, goods, and livestock, without any redress made for same. In other words, it was an enter at your own risk area, warning that neither government would hear cases in any dispute arising out of the debatable lands. Now, the landscape of this area is mostly moors, wooded areas, and it's rocky and mountainous. The soils tended to be poor and generally unsuitable for large-scale farming. However, they were usually sufficient, if not ideal, for grazing livestock like cattle and sheep. When it came to inheriting land, the law of primogeniture giving all land to the eldest son dominated in England. However, in the marches on both sides of the border, they tended to operate under a system known as gavelkind, or partible inheritance, where each son was due a portion of his father's patrimony. Now, the eldest son may get a larger portion, but each son would be expected to receive part of his father's land. This caused the lands to be broken up into increasingly smaller and smaller tracts of land that were less likely to be able to support the families who worked them. As a consequence of this geography and the Marches' inheritance system, they had a very subsistence existence, relying heavily on their food stores and livestock, so they were just barely scraping by. The people of the Marches, despite being on opposite sides of a national border, were more similar to each other than they were to their fellow countrymen in the north, in the Scottish lowlands and highlands, or to the south in the rest of England. The periodic wars and battles that raged between England and Scotland over the centuries meant that armies regularly traversed the marches, plundering food supplies from those who lived there. As a result, the people of the marches were very loyal to their clan or family and had a pronounced lack of loyalty or allegiance to king and country. I mean, how loyal would you be if your king kept marching his army through and the soldiers plundered your land, just so that they could feed themselves? Now, you may be wondering, what is a reiver and what is reiving? Well, the word reeve comes from Middle English, and it means to rob, pillage, or plunder. To survive in this hardscrabble area, the people in the marches often had to turn to reiving their neighbors on both sides of the border of their livestock and food stores. Clans would organize raiding parties to reeve from enemies or others that they knew to be weak and not under the protection of their allies or friends. This was regarded as a legitimate way of living in the marches. So how big were these raiding parties? Reiving parties could number anywhere from 12 men to up to 3,000 or more for larger, more organized raids. So it ran the gamut from small-scale raids to large, very sophisticated incursions bordering on a full-scale invasion. For a raid to be successful, they often had to evade sentries strategically located on hilltops and at river fords, and from roaming patrols on the lookout with dogs. The reiving season was generally in the winter months after the harvest was complete. Food stores would be at their highest, and the livestock would be fattened for winter. The longer nights also gave them more time to lead slow-moving livestock further under cover of darkness. Now, one old story tells of a Scotsman who sat down for dinner only to have his wife serve him a plate with his spurs on it, as a not-so-subtle message. It was time for him to go reeve, because the cupboard was bare. So in case it's not obvious yet, the disputes settled by the warden on truce days were often the results of these cross-border raids. But sometimes you just couldn't wait for the next truce day to recover your stolen food. Waiting might mean starving to death, but there was a solution. March law recognized a right to conduct counter raids to recover stolen goods. Now, how good of an idea do you think that is? March law was very specific, however, in how these counter raids had to be conducted. Known as a hot trod, this legal counter raid had to be conducted within 6 days of the offending raid. Reivers on a hot trod seeking to recover their goods had to advance with hound and horn, hue and cry. So while the reivers who stole your cow Bessie could sneak up and take her, if you wanted to steal her back, you had to do so making noise with dogs, horns blowing, men crying out. And here is an example of a reiver's horn that they would be blowing on as they proceeded to their raid. Making noise was not the only requirement. It sounds silly, but there was also a requirement that they carry a piece of burning turf on a spear or lance to indicate that they were a lawful counter-raiding party and not an illegal raiding party. In other words, while you could be raided in secret, your counter-raid couldn't legally be a clandestine affair. You had to make your presence known audibly and visually. Persons encountering the hot trod were under obligation of law to join it and help the counter-raid, or be considered complicit in the original raid. Failure to do so could result in execution. The hot trod would sometimes be monitored by one of the deputy wardens or a local official that was appointed by the warden called a keeper. Hot trods were very dangerous with a very low probability of success because, of course, the original raiders would know and expect for a counter-raid to occur. As a result, ambushes and skirmishes were very common, often ending in bloodshed. In some cases, the victorious side would simply hang all the men of the losing side, so they were also very bloody affairs. So what does one wear to a hot trod? What were the typical clothes worn by the Reivers? They would have breastplate armor, chainmail, or jack of plate over a doublet. If you weren't rich and couldn't afford a breastplate, because that's a very sophisticated piece of armor, jack of plate was a good alternative. Wafers of steel were stitched and quilted between two layers of leather to form a jacket that offered protection from glancing blows of a sword. And as you can see, this is a jack of plate there on the right. On their head, they wore several styles of helmets, but regardless of the style, they all came to be known as steel bonnets. Here's an example of a steel bonnet. They would have knee-length riding boots with spurs, because of course they were mounted. They didn't proceed on foot because it was just too great a distance usually. They would have padded or armored gauntlets to protect their hands and wrists. And they would also be carrying a targ with a small sword. A targ is a small circular shield that would be worn on the left arm, and the small sword would be accessible to be held in the left hand. When skirmishing in the right, they would have a spear, a lance, or a large sword, but they would not have a two-handed claymore sword. As the Reivers, being on horseback, you really couldn't ride well and control a two-hander sword. Sometimes some in the party would carry a crossbow, or more rarely a longbow, but archers were more commonly used by the side being attacked and fired from defensive structures rather than from on horseback. And by the late 1500s, firearms were making an appearance, so one might have a pistol or a long gun. And lastly, they did not wear tartan kilts. That came much later. Now, beyond 6 days, a posse known as a cold trod could be formed. A cold trod could investigate raids and issue bills of complaint under the authority of a warden, one of his deputies, or a keeper. But the cold trod could not immediately recover stolen goods. Bills of complaint were like a summons, like a lawsuit, and were settled at trials by the wardens on the next truce day. This will probably come as no surprise, but as time went on, this system became more and more acrimonious and less effective at keeping the peace. So how did they defend against raids? Clan leaders and wealthier families built fortified towers known as peel towers to store their food stocks, look out for approaching raids, and to shelter their family or clan in the event of attack. Peel towers were like castles, but lacked a true bailey or ward and tall fortified walls. In other words, the feature of castles they share is the keep, or donjon. Now, donjon, it's kind of a strange sounding word, but oddly familiar, and that's because our modern word dungeon is a corruption of the word donjon. Some peel towers had an enclosed barbican, similar to a bailey, which could protect livestock that were herded into it. But barbicans were not fortified walls. Often they were just berms of earth or low stone walls that impeded reivers from being able to easily round up livestock. And here are a few examples of peel towers that have survived to the modern day. They were multi-story and often had a ledge around the top from which defenders could fire arrows without being limited by slotted windows that were built into the walls of the tower. And of course, it was also advantageous to be built on a hilltop or rocky outcrop to improve the range of view and to impede attackers from getting inside. Now, if you couldn't afford a peel tower, or you lived away from your laird's peel tower, a fortified farmhouse called a bassel was how you could hold up during a raid. Here's a ruined bassel, and here's a bassel that still exists but has been modernized and updated with a new roof. It could protect you and your family and some of your stores, but not really your livestock. You couldn't herd your livestock into a bassel. They were not as safe because back in that time period, the roof was thatched. And so one way you could attack a bassel was to set fire to the thatching of the roof and smoke out the people inside. So being smaller and without as robust means of fighting back, they were far more vulnerable. Now, here are a few of the clans and families of the borderlands who were known to be reivers. Some of these families had branches in multiple marches, like the Armstrongs that lived in the West and Middle Scottish marches, or even on both sides of the border, like the Grahams of the Scottish and English Western March. Over time, many of the clans and families developed alliances with other clans and families, while others became mortal enemies. Then there were those that would simply shift alliances whenever it became convenient for them to do so. And some clans offered protection to non-reiving families, but always at a cost. So when planning a raid, it was always advisable to consider the relative strength or weakness of your target and consider the politics of who their allies or protectors were. Now this chart shows kind of a few of the more persistent raids, rivalries among the clans and family. As you can see, Armstrongs, Elliots, Grahams, Irvines, and Kerrs were frequent enemies of lots of clans, but that was also because they were among the strongest of the reivers and thus made enemies much more easily. While reiving had occurred since the 13th century, it began accelerating in both frequency and severity in the 16th century. The wardens, deputy wardens, and keepers became less effective in maintaining the peace because those appointed to those positions often came from reiving families themselves and used their position to the advantage of their clan or family. And those who were appointed that were not from the borderlands often couldn't command the respect of the people in the area they were policing. England went so far as to consider fortifying the border itself, or even rebuilding and expanding Hadrian's Wall, which of course was a Roman era wall in Britain. And then it all changed. In 1603, Queen Elizabeth finally died, and the Kingdom of England was inherited by her double first cousin twice removed, King James VI of Scotland, who became King James I of England. The week following Elizabeth's death became a violent free-for-all, as it was believed by the reivers that the laws of a kingdom were suspended in the period between the previous monarch's death and the official proclamation of the new monarch. Known as the Ill Week, raids were conducted with impunity during that time. James, now the king of both realms, moved quickly to end the reiver as a border problem, since it was no longer a hostile border now that he was king of both kingdoms. He initiated actions aimed at a pacification of the borders. To accomplish this, in 1606, just 3 years later, the English Parliament enacted a law entitled An Act for the Utter Abolition of All Memory of Hostility and the Dependence thereof between England and Scotland, and for repressing of occasions of disorder and disorders in times to come. Scotland's Parliament passed acts along the same lines at the same time. March law was finally abolished, the marches dissolved, and the borderlands were cleverly renamed to be the Middle Shires. If only declaring it to be so and creatively renaming the area could have solved the problem. Of course it didn't. A 10-member commission with 5 commissioners from each country was handed control of the region and given almost unlimited power to solve the Reaver problem. One of the commission's first acts was to pronounce if an Englishman steal in Scotland, or a Scotsman steal in England, any goods or cattle which amount to 12 pence, he shall be punished by death. Now, even with over 400 years' worth of inflation, 12 pence was a very low threshold for the ultimate punishment. Indeed, in the commission's first year, 79 men were executed, most without trial. Hundreds more were hanged in the subsequent years. Reivers sometimes escaped death sentences by being pressed into military service on the continent. These measures did significantly reduce, but did not completely quell the reiving. So James's government began trying to come up with other ways they could accomplish pacification of the borders. If only they could unite these Scots and Englishmen in some common cause. What possibly could that be? Who was a common enemy of these Presbyterian Scots and these Anglican Englishmen? Oh yeah, they both hated the Catholic Irish. In 1609, James established the plantation of Ulster, after he had already granted private rights to planters in the years prior to that. Irish lands in the counties of Ulster were confiscated by the English and were resettled by Scots and Englishmen. Whereas the eastern counties were mostly being settled by voluntary settlers enticed from Britain by the private landowners offering cheap leases on land, the western counties were, let's say, less voluntary. The Border Reivers became a particularly rich source of involuntary settlers, as the Commission would confiscate the Reivers' land in England and Scotland and banish them to Ulster, particularly to County Fermanagh in the southwest of Ulster. And then they would destroy the records of their lands in England and Scotland to prevent them from ever returning. After James's death, his son Charles I began a policy of trying to force the Presbyterian Scots in Ulster into the Anglican Church of England. Rather than convert, some of these Scots decided to continue further west to the newly forming American colonies. In the 1710s, migration by the Ulster Scots to America, particularly into the port of Philadelphia, began taking off. Now, most of the new immigrants did not stay in Philadelphia long. They mostly headed west into central Pennsylvania or south into the unsettled lands of the upland South. And so as you can see on this map, the line in green shows their route into Philadelphia and then further west into the mountains of the Appalachians, up and down the coast. These Ulster Scots also acquired a new name in America. They came to be known as the Scotch-Irish, or sometimes Scots-Irish. Most actually resented the moniker because they did not see themselves as Irish. The term Scotch-Irish or Scots-Irish is almost exclusively used in America. It's also important to distinguish that direct Scottish migration, which generally came from the Highlands, to distinguish that the Scots migration directly came from the Highlands usually, and the Ulster Scots arrived from Ireland, but originally came from a variety of locations in Scotland. So they were different in that they had the stopover in Ireland. Ulster Scot migration continued in large numbers until 1775, when it was interrupted by that little thing called the American Revolution. Over 200,000 Scotch-Irish had arrived by then, which was over half of the total number of immigrants from Ireland. So over half the Irish immigration was actually not Irish, it was Scottish. And during the American Revolution, the Ulster Scots were almost uniformly patriots in the American Revolution, which contrasts to the Highlanders, many of which were loyalists that fought for the crown. Another 100,000 Ulster Scots migrated between the end of the American Revolution and the War of 1812. By the time the War of 1812 ended, it picked back up, and by 1850, 500,000 Scots had immigrated to the U.S., and almost 1 million more before the turn of the century. County Fermanagh lost so much of its former Reaver population that it is one of the factors of why today it is a majority Catholic county in Ulster. It's one of the few counties in Northern Ireland that is Catholic. The Scotch-Irish Ulster Scot migration is considered to be one of the most influential waves of migration to America. I mean, after all, it did produce a few guys you may have heard of before. 2, 4, 6, 8. Oh, that's 19 of them. One's missing. Yeah, him too. Now, of those 20 presidents with Ulster Scot descent, it is only certain that 6 of them have Reaver descent, and that would be Jackson, Johnson, Grant, Wilson, LBJ, and Nixon. There is also a pair of famous inventive Americans with Reaver descent. Alexander Graham Bell had Graham ancestors who were from the Reeving Graham family in the Borderlands. And Thomas Edison's mother was an Elliot descended from the Reeving Elliots. In spiritual matters, the Reverend Billy Graham was also a descendant of the Reeving Grahams. And then there is the most famous descendant of the Reivers of all. You may be asking, how can you be more famous than a U.S. president? Well, Neil Armstrong, the first man to set foot on another heavenly body, is a direct descendant of the Armstrong clan of the Western Scottish March. And he was even made an honorary freeman of the village of Langholm in Scotland, where his ancestral homeland was located, when he visited the area in 1972. Now, in the centuries since the pacification of the borders, the image and the reputation of the Border Reivers underwent a bit of a reformation. In the early 1800s, the literary and artistic movement known as Romanticism thrived. They lionized human emotion, nature, and the past while casting suspicion on science and industrialization. Romantic writers turned to the history of the area they were in and harkened back to stories of the past for source material from which to work. As industrialization gave rise to soot-covered cities, Romanticists also layered in literary descriptions of idealized nature and simple agrarian living. They also fixated on the idea of the hero worship, and a strict delineation between the hero and the villain. They also revitalized a dormant genre of literature, the historical romance. Perhaps no writer did more to popularize the historical romance more than the Scottish novelist and poet Sir Walter Scott. Born in Edinburgh, Scott contracted polio at a very young age and was sent to his grandparents' home in Roxburghshire to convalesce, spending much of his childhood there in the old East March, near the ruin of Smailholm Tower, the well-preserved Peel Tower, and he was being regaled by his grandmother with tales of the border, no doubt including the story of the Reivers. In the early 1800s, Scott began churning out a series of romantic novels, such as Rob Roy, Ivanhoe, and Waverley. He also composed poems, ballads, and short stories, some of which cast the Border Reivers in a new light as heroic and romantic figures, living by a code of honor. He often depicted them as being noble men, reluctant to shed blood, faithful to God, and unwilling to tell a lie. And it was also Scott who largely invented and popularized the idea of specific tartans for clans and families in the 1820s. So the whole notion Of each clan having its own pattern of fabric, Scott was the one that invented that notion. They're still writing historical romance novels about the Reivers to this day. Here are just a few of the book covers I found for romance novels involving the Border Reivers. Apparently, these strapping young male models didn't get the Border Reiver dress code memo that the Reivers did not wear tartan kilts, nor did they carry claymore swords, and that they wore breastplate or jacket-plate over their chests. I suppose the bare-chested men, though, sell more books. Scott's work weren't the only examples of romanticization of the Reivers. Traditional ballads that told the tales of the Reivers also started to be written down, and often rewritten to improve or embellish the story. Several of the ballads involving the Reivers were among 305 ballads anthologized in the Child Ballads. Now, to be clear, the Child Ballads aren't ballads for children. In fact, you would rather horrify children reading some of them, but rather a collection of English and Scottish ballads that were compiled by an American scholar named Francis James Child. Other ballads in the collection include tales of King Arthur, and many are about Robin Hood. Still more are based on known historical events. One of the more famous involving the Border Reivers is ballad number 186, telling of William Armstrong of Kinmont, aka Kinmont Willie, a Reiver who was captured and imprisoned by the warden of the English Western March on a truce day in violation of March law. His mirror, the warden of the Scottish March, Walter Scott, not the poet, but an earlier person named with the same name, who had the nickname Bold Beauclerk, who himself was a Reiver, asked for him to be released. When the English warden refused, Scott organized a raid on Carlisle Castle, where Willie was being held. With the inside help of English Reivers from the Graham family, Willie is rescued from the castle without any loss of life and only a broken gate on the castle. The ballad, though, however, leaves out the part about the inside help, making it sound like they broke in on their own. The events of the ballad tell of a story that actually happened. It was a real event that occurred in 1596 and caused a major diplomatic row between England and Scotland, so serious that Walter Scott, Bold Beauclerk, had to surrender himself to the English authorities to prevent a war from breaking out. He was tried for his crime and found guilty, of course. Upon being presented to Queen Elizabeth, she asked him how dare he undertake such a bold and presumptuous raid. Scott replied to her, "What is it that a man dare not do?" Elizabeth was not insulted by the rejoinder, but rather impressed, and remarked to one of her courtiers, "With 10,000 such men, our brother in Scotland might shake the firmest throne in Europe." Well, her words were prophetic, because after Elizabeth's death, Bold Beauclerk went on to lead a company of Reivers that were pressed into military service on the continent to help William the Silent and Maurice of Nassau's revolt of the Dutch against the Habsburg Empire, resulting in the independence of the Netherlands. And of course, the Habsburgs were one of the most powerful empires in all of Europe at the time. Another child ballad, number 193, involving the Reivers, is potentially about one of my ancestors or cousins, named Percival or Parsi Reed, which is why I have a great interest in the Reivers. He was the Laird of Trowend, the estate and site of the Reeds' Peel Tower, and he was appointed as the keeper of the Reedsdale Valley in the English Middle March. Here is Trowend, and this is the Reedsdale Valley. Now, as keeper, he arrested a member of the Crozier clan of Liddesdale Valley in Scotland and delivered him to the authorities. And when he did so, the Croziers vowed vengeance to literally and figuratively make the house of Trowend fall. And this is Liddesdale there in Scotland to the west. Now, Parsi Reed later decides to go hunting with 3 members of the Hall family from Gersonfield, which is on the other side of the Reedsdale Valley. and that family was apparently a little jealous that Parsi had been appointed keeper of the valley rather than the head of their family. Parsi and the three Halls follow the River Reed to a place near its source called Baiting Hope. After a long day of hunting, Parsi lies down to nap, and once asleep, the Halls, they take his powder horn, they poured water into his gun, they jammed his sword into the sheath, and they took the bridle off of his horse. And then all of a sudden, over the mountain, here come 5 croziers riding to Baiting Hope. The Halls wake Parsi up and they warn him about these approaching croziers. But Parsi then realizes that they have betrayed him and begs them to turn and fight with them. And in turn, he offers each of them a horse, an ox, land, and his daughter Jean's hand in marriage. In succession, Johnny, Willie, and Tommy Hall refuse, saying the croziers had thee at the feud, and they will kill both thee and me. So Parsi then curses them as traitors and wishes that they never see their homes again, and says they've left him unable to fight or flee. The Halls watch as the croziers inflict 33 wounds on Parsi before hacking off his hands and feet and leaving him to die on the field. See, I told you this is not something you would want to tell to children. At sunset, a herdsman comes along and sees the dying Parsi and recognizes him. The herdsman takes off his steel bonnet and races for a stream, getting some water, and serves the water to Parsi. Parsi gives the herdsman his blessing and asks him to go to Trowend to relay his dying words. He bids farewell to his wife, his brother John, his daughter Jean, and farewell to his young sons 5, saying that had they been at their father's side, he would this night been man alive. He asked the herdsman to tell of the treachery of these 3 false Halls who betrayed him. And finally he says to let his death be a warning to the lairds of Clinnell and Brandon, who I think may be keepers of other nearby valleys. I've located where the laird of Clinnell was located, but I have not figured out where Brandon was. Now, it is known from land records that Parsi did actually exist. He was a real person that owned land at Trowend. And it's doubtful, though, he actually gave this dying declaration, since it was said that when his family went to go gather his body, they had to bring pillowcases to pick up all of pieces, because he had been far more mutilated than indicated in the poem, in the ballad. And according to oral tradition, after Parsi's murder, the 3 false Halls became so notorious that they had to exile themselves, never return to the valley of their birth, providing convenient foreshadowing to Parsi's wish in the ballad for the Halls to never see their homes again. Now, a little bit of irony. Y-DNA testing I performed on my mother's brother Jerry was what linked our reeds to the Borderlands region. Most of the close DNA matches were either from this region as well, had a known Reiving surname, or both. My Uncle Jerry has a daughter, and she got married in 2012. Her husband's surname? Hall. So I don't know if he descends from the Halls of Gersonfield, but we hope that the Reed-Hall marriage has buried any feud between them, and Sarah will soon be welcoming their 3rd child into the world any day now. And so that concludes my presentation. So if you're interested in reading more on the Border Reivers, here are 3 books that include a lot of information on them. The 2 that are on the ends are specifically just about the Reivers, while the one in the middle, 984 pages, is a little more dense, and it's not just about the Border Reivers, but also 3 other migrations to America that kind of formed the early American culture. So it includes the Borderland Reivers, the Quaker migration, the Pilgrim migration, and the Cavalier migration. So if you're interested, I'll leave this up for a while we take questions. And let me see if I can access the chat now and see if anybody has asked any questions while I've been working. Okay, nobody put anything in the chat. Does anybody have anything they wanted to ask?
That was fascinating. Oh, I'm going to go ahead and start off, because one of the things that struck me was when you were talking about the numbers, that there were groups of 3,000 that
Yes.
were going on that. And when they do something like that, who are they pulling from? It's obviously not just one family. Is it an entire community that would band
Oh yeah,
together?
it would be a clan, and these clans could often be quite large, and those would be planned out weeks in advance, and they would have like a meeting place that would be outside of any of the villages, so that they could meet up in secret and then cross the border as a group. Like I said, they were very sophisticated. I mean, you think about 3,000 people. I mean, there are armies that have attacked countries that have been smaller than 3,000 people.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that seems like a huge amount of the population that was taking place in it.
Yes.
And I, of course, appreciated the tie-in to the presidents that we had talked about. Out of those presidents, was Andrew Jackson the only one that was like a direct descendant? I mean, I think his family actually came from Ulster. Is that right?
Yeah. Jackson, Andrew Johnson, Grant, Wilson, LBJ, and Nixon. I mean, Nixon is a Reiving surname, and Johnson is a Reiving surname. So both Andrew Johnson and Lyndon Johnson are from the Scottish Johnsons that were in the border region.
I have a question.
Yes.
I have one of my side of my tree goes to the Tweedies, spelled two different ways, one with a Y on the end, the other one with an IE.
Mm-hmm.
And they were in the area along the Tweed River. Now, is that considered I always thought that was the borders.
Yeah, that was in the kind of the border region, because I mean I've heard that name before, and I'm trying to find in one of the books here that lists a more complete list of the Reiving surnames to see if I can find that one. But it more than likely was. I mean, Tweeddale, which was the name of the valley,
right.
Is nearby.
Right, they were on the Tweed River. I've got a book that was written by a gentleman in 1919. It was written by a Tweedy, actually, and it's a history of the Tweedy family. And
yeah, it would not surprise me.
It goes back into 1200s. Now, I recently joined Scottish genealogy, trying to track this back to prove that I came from there. And a gentleman right away jumped right on me when I said Tweedy clan, and said clans were in the north, not in the south.
Right. But that's kind of the distinction between clan and family in my presentation, is that the clans is what they used as the name in Scotland, and families in England. The distinction can kind of be muddled because, like I said, there were a lot of them that operated on both sides of the border, such as the Grahams. Like Billy Graham always claimed that his Grahams were the English Grahams, but the Grahams were more on the Scottish side than on the English side. Yeah, I'm not finding a specific reference to the Tweedy surname, but like I said, I'm very familiar that Tweeddale was an area that Reiving occurred in.
Yes, they were there in Dumfries. I think it's called Dumfries or something like that. And
yeah, it's in the Western March.
Most of the things are them being hauled into court in the local places, and being hauled in the court. They were kind of like the family you described. They were always out there feuding with somebody over land, it seems like. And finally, in the late 1600s, early 1700s, it pretty much had all left. And I have not been able to find the jump from.
Well, and that's what I'm saying, that a lot of them, they had their land confiscated, for the reaving and were sent to Ulster and then on to America afterwards. And so it oftentimes was not voluntary. I mean, it depopulated the borderlands area quite a bit when they started pushing those families over into Ireland. I mean, that's how we think my Reed family came to America, was that we lose the trail of how they got here because they were in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in the 1740s. That's when the first place where we pick them up in America. But we can't make the jump back over. But the area they were in, I mean, that's prime territory for where the Ulster Scots were being settled. And
Oh, I can find
we know
my,
from land records in England that the Reed family, that was the Reeving Reeds, had their land confiscated and were sent to Ulster. So we just
Now,
can't make that final connection.
yeah, that's what I know. I can find mine in North Carolina. Pick them up again in North Carolina in the early 1700s. But I
Right on
can't,
time.
yeah, they just can't make that jump. And the one family I can find in Scotland is near Edinburgh, and that was in the late mid 1600s. And then the next thing I know, they're in the Americas.
Yeah, you see, that would probably be a lowland migration, not a reaver migration, though, from that area.
That could be. Have you ever read the books or looked into the books by David Dobson?
No, I'm not familiar with it.
Okay.
What's the title?
Well, he has a lot of them. He has about 7 or 8 different books. And I haven't found them yet in the library, but I really haven't looked for them that much. I know I'll be able to find them in Salt Lake, but I don't know about around here. Some of the titles are Scots, colonist of early America, Directory of Scottish Settlers in North America, Scottish Immigration to Colonial America, and Scots on the Chesapeake Bay. And then
So
also
right on point.
Yeah, he's got a whole series of them.
I'll have to look him up. David Dobson.
Yeah, Dobson. Yeah.
Here, let me take it back to the reaving surnames. Let me go back to that slide here. Just in case people wanted to get a better look at that one again. I'm sorry, it has to go through my animation again.
So while you
Yeah,
do
there's
that,
no-
Craig, somebody asked, are we going to put this presentation on the Society's webpage so that they can view it again?
Yes, if you recorded it, then
I did.
Then we can edit it into a video. Then yes.
Perfect, thank you.
So, I mean, if you have one of these surnames in your tree, there's a possibility that you come from the Reeving region, the borderlands. And as you can see, a lot of those are fairly common in America. I mean, Armstrongs and Nixons and Douglas, although not all the Douglases were Reivers. There were some that were in the lowlands and the highlands. Douglas was a major clan in Scotland.
So what are these counties that you're calling the Reivers? The counties now, or whatever you call them.
Well, the county, I mean, it didn't even encompass all of the counties in northern England. It was only the northern part of Northumberland and Cumbria that were in the English side. And the Scottish ones have actually been renamed and reorganized several times. I mean, one of the modern county names is actually very unimaginatively called Scottish Borders.
Yeah, I saw that on there.
I think there's a
You're welcome,
rugby
Seal.
club called the Reivers too, right?
Yes, I mean, like I said, it's picked up and developed a new life as a result of the romanticization. Oh, and I also need to mention the background behind me. Down a little bit. Oop, it's picking up my chair. I found that image. This is an image in the Reedsdale Valley that's about 1.5 miles to the west of where my reeds came from, where the Trow End Tower, Peel Tower, was located. It no longer is in existence. It's one of those that got torn down. But there is actually a bed and breakfast that incorporated part of the old structure into it. So one of my bucket list items is to go on a trip to Britain again, and while I'm there, to visit the Reedsdale Valley and stay at I think it's Dunn's Farmhouse B&B, because that is where the Reeds' home was at, and they actually even name one of the bedrooms in the house after Parsi Reed.
Oh, cool. Very cool. So, Craig, I have a question, and if other people have, I'll check in there. But when they came to, when the now called Scots-Irish came over to America, they had adopted the term Irish, which I don't think if they were when they originally traveled over there, it was obviously against their will, and they probably wouldn't have wanted to be identified as Irish.
Oh, they didn't. I mean, I almost included, there was a quote in one of I have one of the books that I'm using was one of those that I've shown, where somebody in Philadelphia referred to one of these immigrants as being Irish, and he, in very Scottish brogue, answered back that I'm not Irish, I be Scottish.
Okay. Yeah. So
they did not consider themselves Irish at all.
Okay. So the Scotch-Irish is a Americanization of what we decided.
Right.
And then I had the name that was popping up there. So I was like looking at my family tree, trying to go back during your presentation. It was Elliot. And I'm wondering how they kind of moved out to the Appalachians and got so affiliated in that area. I mean, it makes sense that they kind of came down to the south.
There was actually a road.
Oh.
It was actually, let me pull up that slide here again and share.
And maybe I don't know where the Appalachian Range is or what we consider.
Well, it formed kind of the borders of North Carolina and Tennessee. It followed along there. So let me pull up the map again. So you can't really see my mouse, but if you'll notice that there's a very solid black line that follows the green line, that was actually known as the Greater Philadelphia Wagon Road, and that was the route that they took to the south. So the Appalachians cover most of western Virginia and the state of West Virginia, western North Carolina, eastern Kentucky, eastern Tennessee, and parts of South Carolina. You see, the Tidewater area from the Maryland coast, Virginia coast, North Carolina, and South Carolina, that all got settled by the Cavalier population, the people that came from the south of England, that they formed kind of the aristocracy that moved over, the so-called second sons of the second sons, and the people that came over as indentured servants, who generally were from the south of England or the southwest of England. And so they had all that land already gobbled up. So the Scotch-Irish, the Ulster Scots, the only thing that they could pick out was the Appalachians. And it was very similar land to where they had come from in the borders. So they felt right at home with it.
Yeah. Okay. Very interesting.
Where did you find that map?
That was just through Googling that this person, I can't remember his first name, but his name is McMillan, and he had it in a blog post of his about the migrations to America. He had just made this map. The red shows migrations by the Scottish Highlanders, because there was also immigration directly from Scotland from the Highlands, and they settled in different areas than the Ulster Scots in general. As you can see, they went more into upstate New York and into North Carolina and parts of South Carolina. And those that were in North Carolina and South Carolina, like I said, they actually tended to fight for the crown during the American Revolution. So some of them actually got booted out and sent to Canada and were largely resettled to a place called Nova Scotia, which got its name because Nova Scotia was settled by a lot of Scottish immigrants as well.
Oh, interesting. So after all that, they still identified with the crown.
Yes. Well,
Wow.
the Highlanders were a very different situation because the Highlanders, you have to remember, they were also the ones that were very loyal to King Charles when Oliver Cromwell and the Rump Parliament started going after King Charles. And so even after the Restoration, when they took King James off the throne and invited William and Mary, the Protestants, to be king and queen, there were many battles between the Scots and the English over the crown after that period, and the Highlanders supported the Catholic James and his son Bonnie Prince Charlie. So I'm not exactly sure why they were that loyal to the crown, but they were.
Yeah.
Okay, were there any other questions or comments?
Nice presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
I learned so much today. Kind of blown away.
I know it's a little dense and I was going very fast, but I also didn't want it to take too long.
Well, I didn't, it's so ironic because I knew there was Scotch-Irish in my family, but I never really kind of put it together on the history behind where that term kind of came from. I knew they were from Ulster, but I never really looked about how they had settled there. So putting it together with Border Reivers and such a fascinating time in history too is pretty amazing.
I mean, like I said, I was very taken with the story. I mean, once I figured out that our reeds were probably the Reiving reeds, I mean, I started reading up on it. It's just like you couldn't put down the. I mean, like I said, I have the other one as well, the big one. I have not read all of this one because I mean, like I said, it is just enormous.
And you're probably turning a lot of corners down on pages that you want to.
No, I never got into the habit of doing that because my parents were school teachers and you treated books with respect. You didn't do things like that.
Okay, I'm sorry for the Gowens family. You don't want to take a look at some of my books. Yeah, that was fascinating. Thanks so much, Craig. I appreciate it.
Welcome.
Very, very interesting, Craig. Thank you.
And we got the recording, so we'll go ahead and figure out how to get that shared. And thanks for joining us tonight, everyone.
Okay.